Hey there, tired listener. Today, you're not just going to relive a historical nightmare, you're going through something arguably worse. An honest attempt to prove that the Middle Ages actually had some good parts. Yes, someone wrote this down on a scroll and thought it was worth repeating. And here we are, sitting in the 21st century, with Wi-Fi, back pain, and a warm duvet, about to travel to a world without refrigerators, but with universities. There you are, lost among crooked stones, dark buildings, and a suspicious aroma that blends expired cheese with medieval promises of sanitation that never quite materialized. This is your welcome committee, a city where charm is more of a theoretical concept than an olfactory reality. The ground is muddy, the climate is humid, always humid, and the looks you get from the locals are that classic mix of suspicion and historical boredom. But breathe if you can, because today isn't about the mold, the fleas, or the cold that penetrates right into your soul. Today is about the exceptions, the rare, unlikely, and almost accidental good things that manage to make it out of the Middle Ages alive. And we're going to start with something that probably never crossed your mind when you think of medieval advancements. The university. Yes, the idea of gathering to hear someone speak for hours on end without the possibility of a visible nap already existed as far back as the 11th century. And worse, it was voluntary. You weren't forced to study in Paris, Bologna, or Oxford. You did it out of passion or desperation, or because you were the third son of a bankrupt nobleman who wouldn't inherit even the family chamber pot. At the University of Oxford, for example, students lived in cramped quarters, discussing scholastic philosophy and, occasionally, participating in street brawls with the town locals. That's not a joke. There were literally skirmishes between students and local merchants. You'd study Plato in the morning, and by the afternoon, you'd be in a fist fight over the price of bread. A truly holistic education. But look, the medieval university had its merits. It was there that ancient texts were preserved, where Aristotle was translated, and where they tried to make sense of the world, even if the conclusion was almost always because God willed it. Even so, you can't deny it. The concept of studying, recording, arguing, it was born there half sweaty, half malnourished, but it was born. And sure, you might complain about your dissertation defense today, but at least no one is debating with a sword whether your argument about St. Augustine is valid or not. Leaving the unheated classrooms, let's move to another medieval invention that stubbornly survived eyeglasses. That's right, that item that allows you to read the wrong medicine bottle before bed was created in the 13th century, likely in Italy. The idea was simple. Your eyes were failing, but you still had to copy 78 pages of a Greek manuscript by hand before dinner. The solution, glass lenses set in frames of wood or metal. The result, an air of wisdom and a headache at the same time. The first models didn't have arms to go over the ears. You basically balanced the lenses on your nose like someone trying to hold back sleep on a Monday morning. But don't underestimate them. Thanks to glasses, the monk who was already seeing everything in a blurry, soft focus managed to finish the Bible, or at least a part of it, and in the process initiated a long tradition of people with myopia being considered intelligent. Advancing through time and boredom, we arrive at another important breakthrough, mechanical clocks. Before them, knowing the time was a matter of faith, or listening for bells, or looking at the sky and saying, sun overhead, must be noon or Tuesday. Precision wasn't really their strong suit. Starting in the 14th century, some cities began installing clocks with gears. No delicate hands here. These were enormous structures with loud bells and mechanisms that looked more like castle traps. But they worked, more or less. Time was still a suggestion, but now it was a suggestion with a soundtrack. And why is this important? Because from then on, people began to organize their activities better, like knowing you had exactly 3 hours to pray before starving to death, Or that class started when the bell rang, even if you were in the bathroom, which of course was just a bucket in the corner. Clocks weren't just technical inventions, they were public markers of collective time. And it's curious how, even living in a world without rush, human beings already wanted to organize the mess. The only thing missing was organizing the baths. But that, well, that's implied. And since the day is already long and you are too, perhaps it's time to mention another small medieval miracle. Hospitals. Yes, there were places dedicated to the care of the sick. I mean, care is a strong word. They offered a bed, some soup and prayers. Much more prayer than antibiotics, since those were still a good few centuries away. Hospitals were maintained by the church and run by monks or nuns. Sometimes, the hospital's only function was to ensure you died with a lit candle beside you rather than alone in a ditch. But still, it was an advancement. A place where they tried to alleviate pain with bloodletting, purgatives, and perhaps a good motivational speech about how heaven is better than earth. The concept of hygiene was still just a rumor, but at least you weren't dying on your own straw mat smelling of goat. Now you died in the name of charity, which, let's agree, is a subtle improvement. And look at that, with all this, you're still alive and maybe even a little more curious. Before you fall asleep completely or pass out from rage, fix that pillow and take a moment to subscribe. Not that it will improve your life, but at least someone here will have a record that you existed. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time sleep decided to run away from you today. It's always good to know there are more people staying up all night for questionable reasons. Now turn off the lights. Let's enter this journey into the night together. You wake up, you don't know if it's morning or afternoon because the only window in the room is a slit between two stones, and the medieval sun still hasn't grasped the concept of efficient lighting. Your entire body aches, not because you exercised yesterday, though you did, but because the straw mattress decided to take revenge for the last 7 days of continuous use, including the episodes where the house cat decided that was his bathroom too. You sit up slowly. The blanket is wool, unwashed, and every movement releases a special perfume of mold with a subtle hint of anxious sheep. You try to stretch your arms, but you hit the ceiling. Your room, if you can call it a room, is little more than 20 square feet and is shared with a shelf full of handwritten books and an apprentice who talks in his sleep in Latin. Yes, you live in medieval university housing. Congratulations. It's not Hogwarts, it's just a stone cell smelling of onions and intellectual sweat. But you are at the University of Paris in the 13th century. That's right, one of the centers of knowledge in Europe, where bearded men write complicated things on parchment and discuss whether angels have knees or if everything is just a divine metaphor. Knowledge hangs here between the cold walls and the heated arguments about Thomas Aquinas. You didn't choose to be here. You were sent because your uncle is a bishop and said it would be good for building character. You wanted to be a blacksmith, or at least sleep in. But no, today is a school day. You put on your wool tunic, which once had a color. Now it is stained beige. The leather belt marks the center of your body, or what's left of it after weeks of eating hard bread and turnip soup. The footwear, a kind of closed sandal made of raw leather, produces a specific noise when walking, the sound of giving up. You go down the stairs of the lodging carefully, dodging other students carrying enormous books tied with straps. Books aren't personal items, they are weapons. They are heavy, expensive, and copied by hand by monks with crooked spines. If you lose one, you might as well lose your identity along with it, which, by the way, no one here cares much about anyway. You walk down the street to the lecture building. The sidewalk is optional. The ground is mud with remnants of yesterday, and by remnants, understand any type of medieval fluid you would prefer not to name. You jump over a hole, dodge a cart, and are almost run over by a hurried horse. Because yes, even the horses seem to have more purpose than you. Today, you arrive at the university courtyard, an imposing stone building, cold and full of echoes inside. The rooms are long, with wooden benches that defy human anatomy. You sit down and wait. The professor enters. A man with a long beard, black tunic, and the tired look of someone who has seen too many students sleeping with their eyes open. He begins the class by reading aloud a text by Aristotle, translated from Greek to Latin, and then poorly adapted into Old French. You try to keep up, but the human heat, aka the smell of people, and the rhythmic repetition of the phrases provoke in you the effect of a sleeping spell that not even the monks know how to reverse. He discusses logic, morality, theology. He speaks about the existence of evil, the origin of the soul, and why it is wrong to dance in public. All this while, a student walks past you, smelling of goat, taking notes with charcoal on a piece of repurposed wood. And you think, I could be tilling the earth. At least I'd have sunlight. But knowledge also shines, even if it looks like a weak candle fighting against the wind. In the interval, you go to the small tent where they serve food. It's not a cafeteria. It's an improvised shack with a woman who hands you dry bread and a piece of cheese with a dubious texture. The bread was made yesterday or last week. The cheese already has a personality of its own and probably a medieval microfauna developing in silence. You chew slowly, watching the other students discuss which philosophical school best explains poverty, while clutching their leather pouches filled with coins donated by generous priests. Medieval irony never rests. The bell rings again. This bell is the sound of discipline, of measured time, of divine order. Clocks are still rare, but the bell is the audio feed of the Middle Ages. It commands your routine: sleep, wake, pray, study, eat, pray again. The bell rings and you obey, because it's either that or be called a rebel. And here, a rebel doesn't get a Netflix series. They get penance and perhaps a prolonged stay in reflective silence in a damp basement. You go back to the room. The class is now with another master, a specialist in rhetoric. He teaches you how to construct arguments using classical models: major premise, minor premise, simple conclusion. But he demands you use real-life examples like, why shouldn't a monk wash his feet on odd-numbered days? Or how to identify a heretic by the intonation of their voice. You try to participate, but your head is already oscillating between "I want to sleep" and "I wonder if anyone would notice if I left now." Spoiler: they notice and they don't like it. The end of the day arrives with one last lecture, a reading of the works of Boethius, followed by a group discussion. In other words, you sit in a circle with other students and repeat what the professor said. If you say something new, you are corrected. If you say the same thing, you are praised. The important thing is to keep the system spinning. You leave the class as the sky darkens. The streets are almost deserted now, except for the occasional vendor pushing barrels, and two gentlemen aggressively discussing theology regarding which saint intercedes faster. You return to the lodging. Your feet hurt, your head is heavy, and the tunic is already absorbing the humidity of the environment. You lie down. The straw mattress remains the same, but now it seems less hostile. After all, you survived another day at the medieval university, with honor, back pain, and a piece of fermenting cheese in your pocket. And as sleep arrives slowly, you think, at least there was no plague today, right? You wake up again? Yes, again, because apparently living in the Middle Ages is an infinite sequence of natural alarm clocks, the church bell, the village rooster, and the unmistakable sound of someone emptying a suspicious bucket out the window. All this while your body still tries to understand the concept of rest while sleeping on something that resembles a trap made of straw and fungi. But today, there is no class. Today is a work day. The kind of work that starts before the sun decides to rise and only ends when you can no longer differentiate sweat from rain. You put on your usual tunic, the one that was once brown but is now road dust colored with turnip stains, and leave the university lodging. No student rest here. Here, even the intellectual needs to collaborate with the maintenance of divine order, carrying water, helping copy manuscripts, feeding the monastery animals, or digging holes for no clear reason other than the custom of digging. And it is in the middle of this gloriously medieval routine that you stumble upon something almost magical. The mill. Yes, it's there, turning calmly with the wind or the water, depending on where you are. Because the Middle Ages, between one crisis and another, discovered that you could use nature as an intern. If you've never valued a mill, congratulations, today you will. The medieval mill is an immense structure that spins by the force of running water or wind and serves to grind grain, obviously, but also to cut wood, pump water and, in some cases, grind the patience of those living near the noise. You get closer and see a peasant smiling, or grimacing, it's hard to tell, while throwing sacks of barley into the mechanism. Inside, two giant stones rotate, crushing the contents as if it were an agricultural ritual. You watch, fascinated, with that rare sensation that maybe, just maybe, human beings are starting to understand that they don't have to do everything by hand. But easy, don't get too excited. They haven't invented the off button yet. And if the mill jams, guess who's going down there with a piece of wood to unjam it? That's right, you, and good luck escaping without becoming part of the flour. You help unload some of the production and, as a reward, receive a piece of fresh bread, which, in the language of the era, means a compact disc of wheat that could be used as a bladed weapon in case of a Viking invasion. With your belly partially filled and your teeth almost broken, you follow the flow of the village. Today, you are scheduled for another task, accompanying the monks in copying manuscripts. This is where medieval technology shines in a pale way. You enter the scriptorium, where hooded men are concentrated under the flickering light of candles. The smell is a mixture of melted wax, ink made from things you'd prefer not to know, and the accumulated sweat of extreme concentration. Each monk holds a quill dipped in a dark vial. They copy letter by letter, entire pages of religious texts, philosophical works, and sometimes even medical treatises that involve more superstition than science, but nobody comments on that. You sit down, receive a piece of parchment and a quill, and then realize that your mission is to copy exactly what is on the model, without errors, without smudges, and without adding improvements. The sacred text does not accept creative revision. Hours pass, your back screams, your eyes burn, and your handwriting starts to look like a recipe for a poorly cast spell. But you continue because this is the Google of the era. Every copied book is a backup, every word, a thumb drive made of leather and hope. But not everything is letters and oil lamps. The monk responsible for the refectory enters the room and announces that it is time for prayer. Because yes, in the Middle Ages you work, but you also pray a lot, several times a day. It doesn't matter if you are writing, eating, or trying not to freeze. There is always time to ask for forgiveness and give thanks for still breathing, even with so much effort involved. You go to the monastery chapel and kneel beside the others. The prayer is chanted, repetitive, and sounds like a choir of people with colds trying to invoke something between peace and patience. And while the liturgy follows, you notice the architecture around you, that high ceiling, the columns, the stained glass, the calculated echo that makes even a sigh sound like a confession. And then you realize this is Gothic. Not in the modern sense of a teenager with black makeup and existential dramas, but the original article. Medieval Gothic architecture, one of the good things, one of the great legacies. These constructions are gigantic, complex, and made without cranes, without reinforced concrete, and without blueprints in AutoCAD. They were designed by master builders who knew, through some mystical method, how to stack stone upon stone until they formed cathedrals that defy gravity and logic. You leave the prayer and take a walk around the monastery. The garden is simple but well kept, and in the corner there is a small nursery of medicinal plants: lavender, rosemary, sage. And the botanist monk shows you a plant that cures any pain. You ask if it cures boredom too. He doesn't laugh. You help water the plants and listen to stories about the medical treatises circulating, many written based on the texts of Hippocrates, Galen, and even some mixtures of local superstition. But amidst so much guesswork, an interesting idea begins to emerge. Observing symptoms, trying to classify, caring, medicine, or almost a rough draft of it. The sun starts to set, the tasks diminish, and you return to the lodging with tired feet, a wet tunic, and the slight sensation that, however medieval your life may be, you saw things that actually make sense. Mills, manuscripts, architecture, medicinal plants. The day was tough but not completely useless, and that in the Middle Ages is practically luxury. You wake up not with the sun nor with the bell, but with the uncomfortable sensation that your left eye is seeing the world as if it were made of gelatin. You rub, you blink, you try to understand. It doesn't get better. Everything looks slightly blurry, as if the world has passed through a filter of soup grease. The medieval age, of course, has its peculiarities, and among them is the fact that even at 26, your body already shows signs that it's going bankrupt. Your spine feels like it's made of wet parchment, and now your vision has decided to join the fun. You go to the monastery courtyard. Brother Luca, one of the oldest and most nearsighted copyist monks, is there examining sheets of parchment with the squinted look of someone trying to decipher the apocalypse using only their eyelashes. And then it happens. He takes a small object made of wood and glass out of his pocket. He holds it with both hands, positions it over the text, and everything gains sharpness like magic, but without sparkles, without epic music, just an old man reading as if nothing was happening. You approach slowly, like someone staring at a miracle. Brother Luca looks at you sideways and, without ceremony, hands you the thing. You hold it. It's heavy, uncomfortable, unbalanced, but when you place it in front of your eyes, something changes. The letters that were previously blurred now seem to have been cleaned with holy water. "This, what is this?" you ask, with the enthusiasm of someone who found a sacred relic. He answers, "Polished glass to see better. They call them lenses." "Did you invent this?" He laughs. "No, a fellow in Italy. They say he was from Pisa back in the 13th century. Of course it was in Italy. Where else would someone think of polishing glass just to manage to keep copying St. Augustine's sermons without missing the et in the middle of the amen? According to him, it went like this. A group of monks and artisans began to realize that certain pieces of glass, when curved, magnified the letters. They initially used them as magnifying glasses, but one of them had the brilliant idea, what if we put two together? And what if we hold them to the face? And what if we invent the first headache in history caused by poorly thought out ergonomics? And so the first eyeglasses were born, without arms, without style, without comfort, but functional. A medieval advancement worthy of applause or a silent thank you, because clapping in this era is almost an entire social event. You test them for a few minutes. The sensation is strange but effective. And for an instant you feel like you belong to an elite, the elite of those who can read without guessing half the words. Of course, not everyone has access, only clerics, scholars, and those who know someone who has passed through Pisa. But the object exists. It circulates among the few privileged. It is a secret in plain sight, literally. Later, while copying a passage from Boethius, you notice something curious. Your handwriting improves, because now you see where you are writing. You no longer need to glue your nose to the parchment like a hunting dog sniffing out wisdom. Now you can be mediocre with precision, which honestly is progress. At the end of the day, Brother Luca puts the lenses away with the same care as someone hiding a talisman. And you understand it's not just a tool, it's a shield against the inevitable blindness of age, which here arrives before you can even pay taxes. You return to the lodging still impressed, and on the way, you pass a tower. Up there, a monk turns a crank. A bell rings loudly as always, but this time you notice something different. A set of gears connected to weights. A rudimentary mechanism, but functional. The bell rings not just by divine will, but because someone created a machine for it. You ask another student, does that ring by itself? More or less. It's a clock, one of those new mechanical ones. Mechanical clock. In the Middle Ages you stop. Time was a question of faith. High sun, noon, long shadow, late afternoon. But now there are machines that count the minutes, not exactly like your modern phone, of course, but with gears, weights, and a logic that makes even the most suspicious monk sigh. They say these first clocks appeared in monasteries because monks pray all day, literally 7 times a day. And someone, one day, probably tired of missing prayer time, decided it would be good to have a machine that gave a warning. Can you imagine the scene? An angry abbot banging his staff on the floor saying, "Enough praying late, make time work for us." And then someone started drawing cogwheels, ropes, bells, a temporal Frankenstein. You watch the monk wind the clock. The weight descends slowly, moving the gears. The bell strikes. Time moves on, and you think maybe this era isn't just a swamp of diseases, hunger, and itchy clothes. Maybe in the middle of the chaos, someone is really trying to organize life with a little clarity. You head to the refectory. The bread is hard, the soup is bone broth, but you chew with your eyes working and your sense of time restored by gears. At the table next to you, a student murmurs, "Imagine when they invent something to count the hours in your pocket." And the other replies, "Imagine something that tells the time and also serves to pray, write, and measure distance." And you imagine just something like that, which also shows the weather forecast. Everyone laughs because here that is a drunkard's joke. But there in the future, it's just Tuesday. You continue your medieval day thinking you've seen it all. Hard bread, ink that looks like toad jelly, glasses weighing on your nose like a glass anvil. But no, today the Master chooses you for an even nobler mission, to accompany Brother Mateau to the Hôtel Dieu. You've never heard of it. Do you think it's an inn for important lords with back pain? Spoiler, it isn't. It's a hospital, or the closest thing to it in the 13th century. Created by Christian charity, maintained by monks and nuns with superhuman disposition and a resistance to smells that borders on the miraculous. You cross the bridge to the side of the island where it sits, right next to the Cathedral of Notre Dame, which doesn't even have enough gargoyles yet but already commands respect. And there it is, the Hôtel Dieu. A large stone house, wide doors, a smell mixing herbs, wax and people. The first thing you notice upon entering is the sound. Not screams, not despair, but a constant whisper. Prayers, people murmuring psalms, monks walking between beds with lit candles and vials in their hands. An environment that, despite the obvious precariousness, breathes organization. Brother Mateau looks at you and says, "Here we try to cure the body, but mainly the soul." You pretend to understand, but you're more worried about what is hanging from the ceiling, a kind of fabric that blocks the cold, and what is on the floor, straw scattered between the beds to absorb good things. The beds are lined up, some sturdy wood, others improvised. The nuns walk from one side to the other, changing cloths, offering broths, checking if the patients are still alive, and if they aren't, calling a monk to ensure that at least they leave in peace with the beyond. And here is the point. This place didn't appear by chance. In the middle of the Middle Ages, someone had the bold idea that the sick shouldn't just await death at home, that shelter, rest, and even an attempt at a cure were more Christian than just praying from afar and hoping. Thus were born the first Western hospitals linked to religious orders, especially Benedictine and Augustinian. The Hôtel Dieu of Paris is one of the oldest, founded around the year 651. That's right, you heard correctly. The Middle Ages had barely begun, and Parisians were already trying not to die on the street. You watch the treatment of an old man with a swollen leg. The nun in charge cleans the wound with wine, which is the alcohol available at the time. She applies a paste made of honey and some plant that is probably also used to season lamb, and ties everything with a cloth that, judging by the color, has seen better days. It is rudimentary, it is uncertain, but it is care. And that is the difference. For the first time, you see suffering treated not as a punishment, but as something deserving attention. Yes, with prayers, but also with herbs, rare but existing baths, and constant observation. You hear a monk commenting on the balance of humors. He speaks of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, a theory inherited from the Greeks with a touch of medieval creativity. You pretend interest, while trying not to faint from the smell. Outside, the bell of Notre Dame rings. Not that gentle movie sound, but a dry bong that reminds you time is passing, the day still has tasks, and the dinner bread must already be hardening in the pantry. Before leaving, you observe a kind of small library in the corner of the infirmary. Books, manuscripts, medical records, notes on treatments, symptoms, observations made by monks who, even without understanding microbiology, already knew that writing everything down was better than trusting memory, which in that era, by the way, was sabotaged by warm wine and sleepless nights. You ask, are these books used by doctors, by us, and by surgeons when they pass through here? Ah, yes, the surgeons. You've heard of them? Men who cut, sew, drain. They aren't well seen by the intellectual doctors of the university, who prefer discussing diseases to actually touching patients. But the surgeons, they do the dirty work. And the most incredible thing, some of these surgeons began to learn from the Arabs with translated classical texts, with what they saw in the Crusades. A dangerous mixture, yes, but sometimes in the middle of chaos, a good idea is born. Like washing instruments before cutting someone. You say goodbye to the nuns. One of them gives you a piece of cloth soaked in something that helps with the smell. You thank her as if receiving a jewel. On the way back, you cross the bridge again and notice that the river is low. A child throws stones in the water, and an old man plays a flute sitting in a corner, ignoring the world. And you think, if the hospital is like this, imagine the rest. You arrive at the lodging and throw yourself on your haystack with that rare thought. Today, you learned something actually useful. Not a phrase in Latin, not angels with knees, but the fact that even in an era where medicine is still a shot in the dark, someone cares. You close your eyes and breathe deep. The smell of honey is still on your hands. The noise of the bell still echoes in your head, and the sound of the soft prayers of the hospital. Well, even that stayed with you. You return from the hospital still smelling of vinegar and faith on your clothes, and with that strange sensation that for the first time you saw something working reasonably well. I mean, someone made it out alive. That's already better than the average for your hometown. But now, the focus returns to where it always was. Study. You didn't come to Paris for nothing. You didn't leave your house, your warm straw, nor your dog named Bone, just to walk around among the sick and bells. You came to study, to be someone, to have a name, or at least pretend you do, until you discover an inheritance that never arrives. And Paris, at this moment, is the center of the Christian intellectual world. Here the university begins to take shape as something serious, and you are right in the middle of it, literally and dangerously. The next day finds you in a stone room with more than 40 students squeezed in, each trying to keep their spine straight and their nose clean. Difficult. The air smells of mold, candle wax, and something someone stepped in and didn't notice. At the back of the room, a master enters. Long robes, a strange hood, oily beard. He climbs onto a kind of pulpit and opens a book with the care of someone handling a bomb about to explode. Today, we will speak of Aristotle, and the room releases a murmur. Some excited, others faking excitement. You adjust yourself on the wooden chair and think, this is the day my brain shines. The class begins. The master reads in Latin, without stopping, without explaining, without pausing. Apparently the method is, you listen, you learn. And if you don't learn, tough luck. You can always become a farmhand. You try to keep up, but the Latin is faster than your capacity to translate, and you begin to enter a trance. Every word becomes a mantra, every phrase a challenge. In the middle of all this, you realize that your colleague next to you is drawing gargoyles on his parchment. What is this? Studying in the Middle Ages is a mixture of physical endurance and faith in the content. There is no textbook, no summary, no 10-minute explanatory video. There is a man reading in Latin, with the diction of a crow with the flu, and an absurd expectation that you understand everything. You hear strange names, Boethius, Isidore, Augustine, Peter Abelard, each with their ideas, their dilemmas, their internal conflicts written in ornate prose, and you there trying to understand if the soul really has 3 parts, or if it's just hunger. But the most interesting part comes in the break. You leave the class, walk to the internal courtyard of the school, and see 2 students arguing. One of them shouts, "Reason must prevail over authority." The other responds, "But authority was instituted by divine reason." They almost grapple. One pulls the other's sleeve. A third appears with a roll of papyrus shouting, "No hitting with St. Thomas." And you understand. The intellectual debate here is almost a combat sport. And it is in this chaos that great ideas emerge. Because between one fight and another, someone starts to think differently. Someone questions, someone proposes something new, even if they are immediately labeled a heretic and have to sleep outside the city for a week. The medieval university, despite its cold appearance and confusing rules, is the embryo of modern thought. You have professors traveling between cities, students coming from all over Europe, and classes on logic, grammar, rhetoric, the famous trivium. And if you can handle it, afterwards comes the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Yes, music, because in the Middle Ages, studying music means understanding mathematical proportions of sound. And if you sing out of tune, you are probably up to date with your sins. After the break, back to class, now about anatomy. But calm down, no one is dissecting anything here. The study of the human body is still done based on ancient texts, meaning if Galen was wrong, everyone continues to be wrong with elegance. You learn that the liver is the seat of the soul, that the brain serves to cool the blood, that if you have a fever, the best thing is to balance the humors, not with therapy but with bloodletting, purgatives, or a good dose of staying quiet until it passes. You write everything in your improvised notebook with pieces of reused parchment. At some point you scribble in the corner. Note to self, do not let them bleed me because of a sneeze. At the end of the class, you are exhausted but also curious, because despite the rudimentary methods, you realize that you are living the birth of something. The idea of studying for the sake of studying, of understanding the world, of organizing thought. You cross the courtyard and see a group of students with lit torches. They are going to the monastery library. Yes, at night, because sleeping in the Middle Ages is a privilege. They want to copy rare manuscripts. One of them speaks of an Arabic treatise, another of a commented version of Aristotle. A third just wants to find an ink recipe that doesn't explode with humidity. You think about going along, but remember that your candle is at its end and your patience too. So you decide to return to your room. On the way, you see the tower clock. Its gears turn slowly, the weight descends, the bell rings 3 times and you think, the Middle Ages doesn't have much comfort, but it has ideas, some bad, others dangerous, but some really good. You go up the stairs, lie on your pile of straw, and look at the wooden ceiling full of strategic leaks and think studying was never easy, but at least now you know how to suffer with knowledge. You are tired, not just physically, but existentially. And it's not just because of the logic class that felt more like a maze with no exit, but also because your right hand is transforming into a claw thanks to the uncomfortable position of writing sideways for hours. Yes, today you were authorized to enter the copyist's scriptorium, the elite of those who sweat ink and inhale mold to ensure that knowledge doesn't die completely. A place where silence is law and coughing is basically a crime punishable by the look of eternal judgment. You sit at the wooden table, receive a piece of dried parchment and a quill that seems to have been plucked from a goose with bad will. Beside it, an inkwell made of horn and patience. Your mission: copy a passage from a sacred text, letter by letter, without errors, without smudging, without thinking of quitting. The brother who guides you speaks with sweetness. Medieval sweetness, of course. If you make a mistake, rip it up. If you smudge, rip it up. If you sneeze, start over. You swallow hard and dive into the task, and it is in this moment, while trying to remember if Dominus takes an accent or not, that your mind wanders. You begin to realize how much good and useful stuff is being done in the Middle Ages, even in this scenario of chronic fatigue and smell of old leather. I mean libraries, translations, preservation of Greek, Roman, Arabic texts. All this because someone somewhere had the patience to sit where you are now and write everything, letter by letter, by hand with ink made of soot and vinegar. It is impressive and slightly desperate. And since you arrived here, my dear tired listener, this means 2 things. Either you have a hidden pleasure in knowing how books were made before the printer, and by made, understand copied until the soul screams, or you are already so close to sleep that you just need 2 more minutes listening about oak gall ink to pass out completely. So since you're here anyway, do the following. Subscribe, like the video, comment any word your brain remembers. It can be parchment, it can be my elbow fell asleep, it can even be the name of the medieval goat you dreamed about last week. Help this narrator who researched for hours just to remind you that today you can print a book with 1 click. And that, honestly, is a modern miracle. But returning, you slip your hand a little, the ink smudges, the brother looks at you, you smile with guilt, he hands you another parchment, and then you understand why medieval knowledge was scarce. No one can handle copying more than 2 pages without considering becoming a blacksmith. After a few hours, the work ends. You hand in your parchment with handwriting that looks like it was done by someone in a trance, and probably was. You receive a piece of bread as symbolic payment and a look of "you were reasonable," which here is a compliment. On the way out, you cross paths with a group of travelers. They are dirty, tired, and smiling. Strange. One of them carries a box with iron hinges. You approach, ask what it is. "Portable clock," he says. You. "What do you mean, portable?" Him. "We carry it from town to town. Shows the time based on light and shadow." You. "But does it work?" "Almost." You smile because that almost is the entire Middle Ages summarized in 1 word. But you understand, time is being counted, information is being copied, ideas are being preserved. It is all slow, painful and poorly ventilated, but it is real. And in that moment you think, maybe not everything is lost. Maybe the Middle Ages is this strange place where even in the dark someone still lights candles, sits down and writes, just to ensure that the next person doesn't start everything from 0. You return to your lodging with a full head and a numb hand. Lie in your corner, pull up the thin blanket and close your eyes. Because tomorrow there is more. More ink, more parchment, more words you still don't know how to pronounce. But the world is being saved, one copy at a time. Your body still carries the weight of the endless copying from the previous day. Every muscle in your right arm hates you with dedication. Even your shoulder decided to take revenge, locking in an uncertain position between a cramp and a curse. Your mind, well, it stayed back there with the ink-stained parchment where you wrote the word virtue 3 times in a row by mistake and pretended it was an artistic style. But medieval life does not stop, not for pain, nor for nausea, nor for laziness. So you wake up, or at least try to, with the first bells of the morning. Not a gentle alarm clock, is it? More like an anvil being struck by an angry blacksmith. You walk to the monastery refectory. Today the bread seems less hard, which means either it was made yesterday or the rats only gnawed half of it. The porridge tastes of habit, and the water, well, the diluted wine is still more reliable. After the meal, more tasks. Now you will help in the organization of the scriptorium archive, the space where manuscripts are kept, catalogued, and eventually lent to other religious men with steady hands and enough fear of staining something. You observe the amount of accumulated work, piles and piles of rolled texts, tied with rustic cords, many of them smelling of living things. Some parchments have marginal notes, scribbles from monks who apparently also lost their patience in the middle of the process. Others have drawings, delicate illustrations of leaves, mythological creatures, and saints who seem bored with their own existence, a clear reflection of the era. The function of the day is to review a copy of an ancient manuscript, compare line by line, word by word with the original. And you do this with the concentration of someone who knows that if they make a mistake, they will have to do it again. There is no Control Z, only the oppressive silence of the room and the responsibility of not compromising the only known copy of a text that, deep down, might not even be that good. But you realize, as the hours pass, that this tedious process of copying and reviewing is exactly what is holding the threads of history together. Without these monks, full of dark circles under their eyes and committed to calligraphy, half of the classical world would have evaporated in the wind, along with the ashes of antiquity. And if today someone can study Plato or Hippocrates, it is because someone else, long before, spent 20 days copying every comma, with a quill in hand and a growing hump on their back. And that someone today is you. While you work, you notice that the day outside darkens slowly, not because it is late afternoon, but because heavy clouds announce that the weather is going to turn. And of course, rain in Paris means leaks. Many of them, including inside the room where the books are kept. You run to protect the manuscripts with dry cloths and improvised planks. Some monks help, others just watch with that expression of someone who gave up on life in the last century. But the important thing is that no parchment was lost, at least for today. After the scare, a pause. You sit down and feel your fingers throbbing. Your neck is stiff, as if it had been glued with wax. Your eyes burn, but there is also a strange satisfaction, the sensation of having been part of something, of having contributed, even if minimally, so that knowledge survives. Even if no one will thank you, even if you never sign your name at the bottom of the page. At supper time, the bread is back to being hard, which is comforting. At least that doesn't change. And the hot broth tastes of something that was once a root. You eat slowly, thinking about how books outlive people. The texts continue, the stories follow, but you will become part of some random margin, perhaps with your name spelled wrong by an apprentice who also hates writing. And while the wind blows through the cracks of the building and the nearest candle oscillates dangerously, you realize that there is a strange beauty in all this, in the slowness, in the repetition, in the endless copying. You feel that time here has another logic, And maybe that explains why they started inventing the first mechanical clocks in this very era. Not because time was out of control, but because people wanted to at least pretend they had some control over it, that they could measure, mark, predict, even if the hand was still a wire held by gravity. And yes, you saw one of those clocks. It barely worked, sure, but it was a gear with intention. Intention in the Middle Ages is half the battle. The other half is surviving the winter and not being accused of something wrong for having too many ideas. Upon lying down later, you feel your body begging for rest, but your mind still spins. Maybe it's the effect of the watery wine. Maybe it's the strange excitement of knowing that tomorrow there will be more parchment ahead. Or maybe, and here goes a dangerous thought, you are starting to like all this. Not the back pain, nor the dubious food, but the sensation that even in the century of shadows, someone tried to keep the light on with ink and patience. And you are now part of that. You don't remember exactly at what moment your vision began to worsen. Maybe it was after the 10th consecutive candle, after copying 20 pages of the same passage in Latin, or simply after spending 3 days looking at crooked letters with indirect light, cold feet, and hunger in your stomach. But the fact is that now you don't see anything up close without furrowing your brow with so much force that you seem to be trying to summon a vision by telepathy. And that is when you discover one of the most unexpected treasures of the Middle Ages. A pair of lenses mounted in a wooden rim, resting on the nose like humanity's desperate attempt to pretend it understands optics. Eyeglasses. Yes, handmade glasses, with glass thick enough to magnify letters and, as a bonus, show all your blackheads with frightening sharpness. It wasn't magic, nor divine work. It was a process. One of those advancements that arise because someone at some point realizes they are tired of mistaking words because they confused the letter P with the letter R. They say it was around the 13th century in Pisa that a craftsman had the brilliant idea of using convex lenses to help monks and copyists read better. A small gesture, but one that basically saved the visual sanity of an entire generation of scribes. And you, even without knowing the name of this inventor, owe him the fact that you can still copy 3 more lines before your head explodes. Of course, don't expect comfort. These early glasses are like clamping 2 glass bottles onto your face. They weigh, they slip, they fog up with the slightest sign of breathing, but they work. And they work well enough to make you forget for 10 minutes that you are wearing a medieval utensil 3 centimeters from your eyes. And with this new vision, you return to work, but now with a different consciousness. You notice details in the margins of the books. Small figures drawn with red ink, a dog, an angel, a monster with a lazy face, scribbles that show that even the most devout monks also had their moments of, I can't take this Gothic lettering anymore. Medieval life, even in its rare moments of advancement, is made of adaptation. You don't have an ophthalmologist, but you have a monk with connections and access to a craftsman who can cut glass without cutting himself too. And that, within this context, is basically a miracle. You continue your routine, now seeing the world with more sharpness, and not just the visual world, but also the symbolic one. You begin to understand that the Middle Ages, so criticized, so reduced to stereotypes, has its own illuminations. Among them, a pair of crooked glasses that allow you to continue reading, studying, copying, living. And that is how you finish another day, with a piece of wood on your nose, marks on your face, and the certainty that human ingenuity always finds a way to see further, even when the world around still insists on remaining half blurry. You continue your medieval routine, like someone continuing a marathon without knowing where the finish line is, with slightly crooked glasses and a lower back begging for a truce. You even consider that maybe living another 100 years isn't really a great advantage. But then something unexpected arises, an invitation to observe a study session in a neighboring monastery. It's not a party, It's a meeting of tired minds trying to understand the human soul, the medieval equivalent of group therapy, only with Latin, goose quills, and a lot of emotional repression. You enter the hall. It is cold like everything in this era, and the smell is a mixture of mold and candle wax. The participants, almost all scholar monks, are seated in a circle, surrounded by books, parchments, and an almost supernatural patience. They are there to try to understand why human beings do what they do, especially when what they do seems strange. What you witness is what centuries later would be called the embryo of psychology. Of course, everything is still wrapped in thick paper of spirituality and humoral assumptions, but there is a sincere attempt to observe behavior patterns. People who laugh too much, people who cry without reason, people who dig holes where there is no garden. And no one is calling this a syndrome yet. The term of the moment is more like imbalance of bodily humors, which for the time is practically an Enlightenment breakthrough. You see one of the scholars raising a hypothesis that seems too revolutionary for a world where the bathroom is still an optional concept. Maybe, just maybe, sadness isn't just sin. Maybe it has natural causes: lack of sun, bad diet, sleep interrupted by noisy bells and mattresses made of straw, and expectation. And then you think, could this be the start of something? While observing the discussion drag on for hours, you begin to understand the importance of what is happening there. No, they don't have Freud. No, they don't know what a neuron is. But they have curiosity, they have the disposition to sit and try to understand why a person spends 3 days staring at the ceiling without saying a word, or why another explodes in rage because someone moved the wrong piece of cheese. It is rudimentary, it is slow, and yes, sometimes it borders on the absurd, but it is also the beginning of a human journey to understand that not all pain comes from a visible wound, that there is something happening inside, even if no one knows yet how to name it. You, from your corner, start to remember your own episodes of extreme tiredness, the exhaustion that doesn't pass even after sleeping, the feeling of emptiness that appears in the middle of Mass when everything should make sense. And then you realize that maybe this medieval attempt to understand the soul isn't so absurd after all. It is poorly explained, poorly interpreted, and with a huge foot in mysticism, but it is genuine. And in a world where most answers still come from prayers and superstitions, this is already a miracle. The end of the meeting is accompanied by notes, manuscripts with simplistic classifications like wet melancholy or dry anger. Terms that sound more like bad dishes from the monastery refectory, but that deep down reveal a search, the will to make sense of internal chaos, to organize the emotional mess with the few available tools. You leave the monastery with a full head. The cold wind hits your face and almost rips off your glasses, which keeps slipping like a reminder that modernity is still far away. But the thought remains. The Middle Ages, even with all its flaws, sheltered people trying to understand people, trying to alleviate suffering without resorting only to the whip and guilt. On the way back, you pass a small hospital maintained by religious men. Nothing very elaborate: wooden beds, patched fabrics, utensils that look more like light torture instruments. But there is also care there is attention. And even if the treatment is still based on warm wine and words of comfort, the principle is there, caring for those who are not well, and that too is advancement. You arrive at the lodging and sit down exhausted, but for the first time in days, the tiredness has another tone. It is not just physical, it is mental. An exhaustion caused by thinking too much, by trying to understand what maybe will never be completely understood, but it is also a relief, because now you know you are not alone, that even in the century of eternal cold and optional hygiene, someone has already started to think of the head as something more than a hat rack with eyes. You lie down, the sheets remain rough, the mattress remains firm as a board used to beat clothes, but sleep comes faster, because deep in your mind, between one thought and another, exists the idea that even in the most lost world, there is always someone trying to make sense of it, even if just by drawing a chart of humors with ink and faith. You don't even know what day of the week it is anymore. Because, let's be honest, the days here are practically all the same, grey, freezing and smelling of smoke and monastery. But today there is something different in the air, or rather, in the sound. A bell rings rhythmically. It is not that disjointed pealing that announces tragedy or mass. It is an organized, precise, almost timed ring. And you realize with a certain astonishment that the bells are not just calling, they are marking time. Yes, you discovered one more of those miracles of the Middle Ages that no one told you about in school, the mechanical clock. No, it isn't digital, it doesn't have fluorescent hands, it doesn't play an alarm with bird music at dawn, but it works with gears, weights, cogwheels, and the persistence of monks who apparently were tired of missing prayer time because of the lazy winter sun. You approach the tower where the mechanism was installed. It is a large gadget, noisy, looking like it might explode if someone sneezes too close. But it is also a masterpiece. And more than that, it is a symbol of the attempt to control that which until then was uncontrollable: time. Before this, time was more or less a suggestion. The day started when there was light and ended when the candle burned to the end. Everyone lived in their own mental time zone that varied between "it seems early" and "it's already dark, help." But now, with a mechanical clock, the possibility of synchronizing the routine arises, of saying that lunch is at the third stroke and prayer at the sixth. It is the end of subjective time, or at least the beginning of the end. You watch the mechanism working. The weights descend slowly, pulling ropes that move wheels, which push levers that ring bells. All this to say, it is 3 o'clock. 3 o'clock of what? Of suffering, of manuscript copying, of thinking about life and the rats in the lodging? It doesn't matter. The important thing is that now you know it is 3 o'clock, and that changes everything. The most ironic thing is that this invention was born precisely in monasteries, those places where theoretically time shouldn't matter, where the day was a succession of prayers and silence. But the need to organize prayers, fasts, and work gave birth to a system that later would control the entire world. Because, mild spoiler, one day everyone will live at the mercy of the clock, including you. And then you realize what is happening. The Middle Ages, this misunderstood historical villain, is inventing punctuality. Yes, her, that quality that no one likes, but everyone pretends to have. It all starts there, with monks who just wanted to know the right time to pray and ended up creating the foundation of modern social control. In other words, you can blame the Middle Ages for never again being able to turn off the alarm clock without guilt. But not everything is oppression. The clock also brings a strange sense of security. Knowing that time is passing in predictable blocks makes your mind, normally lost in an eternal soon, find some kind of ground. You begin to measure your tasks. Do you know how long it takes to copy a page? Do you know how much time you have until the next miserable meal? And even that, knowing how long remains until chewing another piece of hard bread, is already a kind of comfort. Later, while you listen to the bells ring again, now marking the beginning of the night, you realize that the sound spreads throughout the entire village. People stop, some pray, others just look at the sky, trying to guess if it will rain before bedtime, but everyone, in some way, responds to the call of the bell. It is almost like magic or remote control, only based on sound and collective obedience. And it is in this moment that you understand time, until then a luxury of gods and astronomers, is being democratized in the form of chimes, in the form of gears, in the form of forced routine, which deep down is just another attempt to survive the chaos. You return to the lodging with the sound of the bell still echoing in your ears and notice something curious. Your body has already begun to adapt to the schedules. You wake up with the first strike, feel hunger at the fourth, and drowsiness at the eighth, as if the clock were not just in the tower, but also inside you, in the straw bed with aching knees and a back shaped like a question mark. You think, maybe not everything needs to be spontaneous. Maybe having a structure helps. And if one day modern life manages to organize its own bells, even if digital, perhaps it should thank the tired monks who one day decided to build a contraption just so they wouldn't miss Mass. And you now are part of that too. Hunger still exists. Of course, you didn't expect magic, just a less traumatic interval between one piece of dry bread and another. But today the scenario changes a little. There is something different being prepared in the monastery kitchen. A smell that doesn't resemble damp straw nor boiled turnip. And like every good medieval survivor, you follow the smell cautiously. Because the last time something smelled good, it was just incense covering an expired cheese. Upon arriving at the refectory, you see a large pot being stirred with a wooden spoon, almost the size of a walking stick. Inside, a broth with more body, more seasoning, and shock with varied ingredients. Lentils, barley, a touch of garlic, maybe even a shred of meat. It's almost a culinary miracle. And what you didn't expect is that part of this change comes from a practice that began to spread in monasteries. Medicinal gardening and monastic vegetable gardens. You discover between one spoonful and another that the monks not only plant but research the effects of plants. Lavender to calm, rosemary for memory time, because why not? They don't exactly have a nutrition degree, but they have Arabic and Greek manuscripts and even some of their own observations. And honestly, that is already better than many fad diets. While chewing with more pleasure than allowed in a world without dessert, you begin to understand the food is changing, not for the better yet, but for the less worse. Random meals based on what the field gave us are out, and the first records of functional recipes planned with a minimum of criteria are in. If you are lucky, you will even drink a wine diluted with herbs that they say cleans the blood, which means everything and nothing at the same time, like almost all medieval advice. After the meal, you help in the vegetable garden, not out of kindness, but because he who helps eats more. And there, between lettuces with dubious appearance and onion stalks braver than some nights, you realize something curious. Food is becoming culture, something more than necessity. It's being thought about, tested, even documented. The monks write down which plants work best together, observe the body's reactions, note side effects with an almost scientific seriousness, even if they write everything in Latin and with the calligraphy of someone in no rush to be read. And that is where a novelty enters that you didn't expect. You find a small manual bound in goat leather where someone made a compilation of recipes and treatments based on herbs. It is what one day will be called phytotherapy, but which for now answers to notes that no one understands until they get sick. In any case, there is another seed of the future. Planned nutrition, preventive health, and the beginning of a food consciousness that goes far beyond what can we hunt. But don't get too excited, because deep down we are still in the Middle Ages. And along with the vegetable gardens come also the delusions, like the use of dragon's blood, red resin, or the belief that eating a boiled pigeon cures a headache. Anyway, the important thing is that someone is trying, and you, as a conscious guinea pig with chronic hunger, are participating in the experiment. At the end of the day, while watering the garden with an improvised watering can made of ceramics and bad will, you realize that even in this era so unstable, human beings continue trying to improve what they eat. In their own way, of course, with superstition, trial and error, and a lot of garlic to mask any dubious taste, but still trying. You return to the refectory later and find the monks in silence, eating slowly. The atmosphere is not of abundance, but of ritual. Each spoonful seems more thought out, each ingredient more valued, and this makes you think maybe eating well isn't just a modern privilege. Maybe, even amidst so much difficulty, the act of sitting, eating, and sharing is a type of advancement, an invisible luxury. You close your eyes for an instant, trying to remember the taste of the food from before. Hard bread, warm water, suspicious cheese. And now there are lentils with thyme. Still no dessert, of course, but at least with dignity. And that, my dear, tired listener, is almost a revolution. And don't worry, the bread is still hard, but at least now it comes with a drizzle of olive oil. Now that you already eat, see with less suffering, and even have a reasonable notion of time, more than many people in the 20th century, by the way, there is time left for a medieval luxury, writing what you think, or at least trying, because the truth is that writing at this point in history is still an elite sport, a hobby for few, very few, like you. You sit in a corner of the monastery with an improvised writing board, sharp quill, unstable inkwell, and a parchment that already came used from the other side. Recycling was a necessity, not an ecological virtue. You begin to write with careful calligraphy words in Latin that you memorized without exactly understanding, which, let's be honest, continues to be the case. And what are you doing in the end? Recording, writing about the day, about the changes in meals, about the bells that now regulate your life as if you were an intellectualized chicken. You even risk drawing the clock mechanism you saw the other day. The result looks more like a scared octopus than a gear, but the intention counts. The most surprising thing, however, is the place where you are writing. The library, a dark room, silent, smelling of leather, mold, and concentration. There, stacked on crooked shelves, are the true treasures of the monastery. Books, manuscripts made by hand, letter by letter, by people like you, or with more patience. Some of them have illuminations, colored drawings in the margins, figures ranging from saints to animals that seem to have been created after a night of poor sleep. And once again you realize that you are in the middle of something bigger, a collective and millennial effort to preserve knowledge. Even if that knowledge includes recipes with toad blood or maps where the sea ends in an abyss full of monsters, you return to your table and continue writing. Not because someone asked, but because now it seems necessary. You want someone in the future to know that there were people living, thinking, and trying to understand the world, even when the world refused to cooperate. The writing there has weight, has purpose. And even if it is just a list of the plants that worked in the garden or a record of the bell strikes during the week, still it is history, your history, which, if everything goes right, will end up in the hands of some copyist more organized than you and survive for a few more centuries. Of course, not everyone approves of this new activity of yours. Some monks think that writing on your own can generate dangerous ideas, like thinking, or worse, questioning. But you continue slowly, disguising it, pretending that you are copying a passage from De Civitate Dei, while, in truth, you are describing the annoying tone of voice of the new guy responsible for the bell. You aren't alone in this. All over Europe, small nuclei of writing begin to flourish. Universities already create their own archives. Richer cities maintain scribes. And gradually, the idea of recording daily life takes shape, becomes habit, and later, necessity. You finish your last sentence with a half-smudged period and look around. The environment is quiet, a good silence. That silence that seems to respect what was written, even if no one reads it, even if no one understands, because writing in the end isn't just about being read. It's about organizing thought. It's about resisting the mess, and that you do with mastery, even when you spill ink on the parchment for the third time. At the end of the day, You roll up the parchment carefully, tie it with a fabric ribbon, and store it in a dry corner of the library. Maybe no one will ever read it. Maybe a rat will find the roll too comfortable and transform your work into a nest. But maybe, just maybe, someone in the future will find that and think, look at that, even back then there were people tired of the routine. And then, even centuries later, you will have fulfilled your role. You no longer know if you are living a sequence of unexpected advancements, or if you just got too sensitive to the point of finding anything amazing that doesn't involve cold, hunger, or mysterious diseases. But today, the novelty doesn't come from the bell, nor the garden, nor the library. It comes from a simple room full of wooden benches, a professor with the face of someone who has lost hope, and a group of students who seem to be there more out of divine punishment than vocation. You were authorized to attend a class, and that, believe me, is a privilege, because we aren't talking about just any class. It is a class in a university. Yes, that exists, and yes, it was invented in the Middle Ages. While everyone thinks the medieval period only produced moldy castles and random plagues, you are here witnessing the birth of formal education. You sit at the back of the room, trying not to make noise when leaning on the wood that creaks like a grumpy old man. The professor enters carrying a rolled manuscript with so much zeal that you think it might be a treasure map, but no. It is just Aristotle again. The content is dense, abstract, tangled. There is no slide, no blackboard, no explanation with cat memes. Only voice, citation, and good old repetition. But surprisingly, you begin to understand the logic behind it. They are debating ideas, questioning, discussing, and you realize the most unexpected thing. This is a space of intellectual freedom. It is clear that this freedom has limits, several, almost all of them. But the simple fact that someone can raise their hand and say, I do not agree with this argument, is already revolutionary for an era where disagreeing usually resulted in unpleasant consequences. You watch the students, young, but looking like they have read more Latin than you will ever read anything in your life. Some copy, others doze discreetly. One or another stares at the professor as if waiting for a divine revelation. But all are there because they believe that learning is worth it, that understanding the world, even if through texts with 300 years of delay, is better than accepting it in silence. And the most curious thing, they come from different places. The medieval university is a tower of Babel of accents, habits, and strange clothing styles. There is an Italian trying to pronounce French. There is an Englishman thinking he knows Latin. There are people from the north who have never seen an olive in their life and now live surrounded by vinegar, manuscripts, and strong opinions, and among them you, trying to absorb the maximum while your spine protests against the hard bench and your stomach suggests that maybe Aristotle would go better with bread in the class break. Yes, they also need a break to continue pretending they understand. You walk through the corridors of the university, see more rooms, more students, more manuscripts being carried as if they were firstborn children. And then you remember the University of Paris, Oxford, Bologna. All of them were born here in this period that so many people insist on summarizing with one word only: darkness. You lean against a stone wall and observe. A group of students recites memorized passages, as if memory were more important than comprehension. In part it is. After all, without a printer, without cheap paper, without photocopies, the only way to carry knowledge is pushing it inside the brain and hoping it doesn't leak on the way. And yet you feel respect, because even with all the precariousness, there is a hunger for knowing there, a desire to understand the world, which doesn't come from obligation, but from curiosity. And that, let's agree, is what moves any era, even the moldiest ones. Later, you return to class. The professor is still there, reading at a rhythm that would make even medieval time seem hurried. But now you listen differently. You perceive the gear turning, the construction of thought, the attempt to systematize knowledge. Method is still missing, didactics are missing, emotion is missing, but intention is abundant. And when the class finally ends, because everything one day ends, even classes on Aristotelian logic, you stand up slowly. Your legs fell asleep, your brain screamed for help, and your eyes beg for a bit of open sky. But your heart understands that today was different. Today you saw knowledge trying to survive and succeeding. On the way out, you hear a group commenting on a new idea circulating around. Something about using reason to explain the world. You pretend not to care, but you keep it in mind. Because the idea that thought can be used as a tool, and not just as punishment, will still give a lot of work to a lot of people in the future. You return to the lodging pensive and tired, because thinking is work, especially when the ceiling of the classroom threatens to fall at any moment. But there is a consolation. You lived the day you learned something that didn't involve immediate survival, and that, in the Middle Ages, is almost rocket science. The last bell of the day echoes through the village, like someone whispering, "Congratulations, you survived." At this point, you don't even bother with the noise anymore. It became part of the environment, like an annoying neighbor, but predictable. And after everything you lived through here, the dubious food, the optional baths, the manuscripts with Gothic lettering that look like an eye exam, you even feel a pinch of attachment. But don't delude yourself. The Middle Ages is still hard, the floor is still cold, the bread still has the texture of wet wood, and the pillow is an irony stuffed with straw and insomnia. Only now you understand one thing. In the middle of this scenario, without bubble bath, there existed small advancements geared by monks, artisans, stubborn peasants, people who between one plague and another still decided to think, note, build, experiment. You leave the library, where you spent the afternoon reading about alchemy, and discovering that yes, many people took seriously transforming lead into gold, which, let's agree, is more believable than believing that this straw mattress is comfortable. On the way back to the lodging, your eyes insist on observing details that previously went unnoticed. The clock that marks the hour with frightening precision, the little garden with medicinal plants where before only weeds grew. The lens of your glasses, a disc of glass that prevents you from confusing a cat with a pot. You begin to realize how many of these modern things have roots in this era that they say out there was only shadow and suffering. But now you know it wasn't quite like that. There was shadow, yes, plenty, but there was also seed, lots of it. Things you use in everyday life without even imagining where they came from. Like hospitals, universities, eyeglasses, clocks, even the idea that time must be measured so no one arrives late for work. And speaking of work, you see in the distance a new construction being erected, a mill, another medieval symbol that survived. Because the human being, tired since always, understood that if the wind or water can make the effort for him, better let them do it. Laziness as always being the mother of invention, and you smile because you understand perfectly. Upon entering the lodging, the atmosphere is different, calmer, almost cozy. The cold continues, but now there are wool blankets that don't itch so much. The candles are organized in holders, far from the beds, which is an advancement in safety. And the books previously locked up are now read even by apprentices. It isn't a public library yet, but it is a start. You sit down, pull out the parchment where you have been noting your own history. A diary, maybe a manifesto, who knows? Deep down, it is just your way of remembering that you went through all this, that you survived mentally an era misinterpreted, and that even among fiefs, famines and fungi, there existed intelligence, there existed creativity, there existed people trying to improve the world, 1 mil at a time. And before sleep comes, and it comes, Because you are absolutely exhausted from thinking so much about the past, you do one last exercise of comparison. Think of your current life, of the phone complaining about brightness, of the microwave that beeps, of the Wi-Fi that drops, of the milk that expires in 3 days. And you realize that yes, a lot has evolved, but much of what surrounds you today only exists because someone in a freezing monastery decided it was important to measure time, or see better, or care for the sick without first blaming the devil. You blow out the candle with your fingers. The smell of smoke is strong, but familiar. The straw of the mattress creaks as always, but your body doesn't mind as much because your mind is light. Not because of ambient music or chamomile tea, but because now you know that not everything in the Middle Ages was ruin. There was construction, there was invention, there was silent resistance. And with that comfortable thought, you finally close your eyes. The sound of distant footsteps in the corridor turns into white noise. The memory of the bell becomes a melody. And the Middle Ages, which before was just a blur of bad stories, is now a place where you lived, where you learned, where you resisted, even if only by imagination. Good night, tired listener, and until next time, sleep with a tired story.